Hello everyone. Today we'll be talking about IMAPS in DNS. We will also be discussing how to install them on a few different kinds of servers, as well as a few hardening recommendations for each of them. So let's get started. First we'll start with IMAPS, or the Internet Message Access Protocol Secure. It bears a lot of similarity to the previously discussed Post Office Protocol 3, as it works as a mail server designed to deal with incoming mail as opposed to outgoing mail. The mail that it receives is stored in a database. IMAPS also provides a sorting function that allows users to configure how their mail becomes organized, such as inside of folders or files. The difference between IMAPS and Post Office Protocol 3 is that the latter only downloads an email message to a specific device, whereas IMAPS operates more as a server, which can be interconnected with many devices, and they're synced across all the devices that have access to it. This is the secure version of the IMAP protocol. As the name implies, it operates over either SSL or TLS, or secure sockets layer, or transport layer security, both of which use port 443 to encrypt email data being transmitted to essentially give greater security online and keep the integrity of data. Now we'll discuss how to create an IMAP server using Dovecot. Dovecot is an email server predominantly used on Linux machines and can be used in conjunction with IMAPS to receive emails using the following steps. The first step is to install Dovecot on your Linux machine with the following commands. Most of these commands will require for the user to be in the sudo file, but the first command is sudo install dovecot-core dovecot-imapd. Next, you'll need to create a username and password for the user of the server and create a mailbox directory. To create the username, use the sudo user add name-m command, and then for the password, use sudo password name. And then finally, the create directory with sudo /home/name/maildir. Ensure that uncomplicated firewall has IMAP traffic allowed on Dovecot, and that can be done using the following command: sudo ufw allow Dovecot secure IMAP. And then finally, test the functionality of your server by using the mail command on Linux terminal. Now we'll discuss a few hardening strategies when using IMAPS with Dovecot. The first is to use firewalls to restrict access. Configuring your firewalls to only allow specified users within an IP range, or to block potentially unwanted users, can be a useful strategy in hardening your IMAPS server. Next is to use strong authentication. Ensure that all users that have access to the mail server are using strong password policies, and potentially look into more authentication methods such as multi-factor authentication and stronger authentication methods. Lastly, we have routine software updates and patches. Routine patches can keep your mail server up to date and secure against currently known vulnerabilities in the Linux community. This can be done using the Linux terminal and also requires a user in the sudoers group, and can be done with the command sudo apt update. Now let's discuss DNS. DNS, or the domain name system, is a service that translates human-readable domain names, such as google.com, into computer-readable IP addresses. The purpose of this process is so that a computer can find the IP addresses and are able to load web pages and resources. There are 4 different types of DNS servers that play a role in retrieving a web server or a web resource. The first is the DNS recursor, which receives the request from the client and typically results in more requests being filed. Next, we have the root name server, which begins to translate the host name into an IP address and serves as a launching pad to other resource locations. Then we have the top-level domain server, which is responsible for addressing the last portion of the host name or the top-level domain, such as the .com in google.com. And then finally, we have the authoritative name server, which will attempt to access the requested record and will finish translating the domain name into a computer-readable IP address. The authoritative name server will then return the found IP address back to the DNS recursor. Now we'll discuss how to construct a DNS server using the Internet Information Services. The IIS, or Internet Information Services, is a Windows server platform that can be used as a DNS server when configured. Before you set up the server, a few prerequisites must be set in place, such as an account with administrator privileges and a static IP address for the server to launch on. The first step is to install the DNS server role. This can be accomplished by running the following command on Windows PowerShell: install -Windows feature -name DNS. The next step is to configure what interfaces or IP addresses to query for. This can be done by accessing Windows Administrative Tools, DNS, and then right-clicking and selecting Properties, and inputting the allowed IP addresses. Then you have the option to configure root hints, which are servers that assist other DNS servers if they come across a name that is not recognized. And finally, at any point you wish to remove the DNS server role, just use the following command: uninstall -Windows feature -name DNS. Now we'll discuss a few DNS hardening strategies when used in conjunction with Internet Information Services. First is to use DNSSEC. DNSSEC is an added layer of security when making DNS queries by authenticating DNS responses. This prevents malicious attacks that can be levied using domain name system, such as spoofing and flood attacks. Next is to lock the DNS cache. Typically, caching is used to speed up DNS queries by reusing information. However, this information can be poisoned by hackers to reroute the cached DNS request to a malicious website or download that the hacker has implemented. And finally, we have Configure Access Control Lists, or ACLs. Limiting who is able to access the DNS server can prevent unwanted users from either querying from malicious websites or updating DNS records. Implement an access control list so that only those who are authorized to update and query the DNS server are able to do so. Now we'll discuss how to use domain name system with Bind. Bind, or Berkeley Internet Name Domain, is a Linux distribution that can operate in conjunction with DNS to create a DNS server, which is able to translate domain names into IP addresses. The first step is to install Bind through the Linux terminal using the following command: apt install bind9, bind9utils, bind9-doc-y. Next, you may edit the configuration file under the etc/bind/name.conf/options to edit certain parameters such as allow query, which specifies what IP range can query the server, and much more. Make sure to check the syntax of the file with the named -checkconf command. Next, you should determine the forwarding and reverse zones in the local configuration file under /etc/bind/named.conf.local, and creating a corresponding forward and reverse zones by copying the db.local zone file and edit them with your specified IP address. Finally, you restart the server and test the functionality using the following command: nslookup bind server. Now we'll just discuss some hardening strategies while using DNS with Bind. The first is to disable recursive queries. Recursive queries are typically useful as they allow you to reference previous query results. However, they can also be used maliciously in DNS amplification attacks. You can remedy this by simply adding the recursion no to the config file discussed on the previous slide. Next is to limit query rates. Limiting the rate at which queries can be sent can prevent DNS flooding. Accomplish this by editing the bind config file discussed in the previous slide and adding the following options under responses -per second and then the desired amount of time. Finally, we have logging queries. Logging DNS queries can enumerate suspicious requests or unusual traffic on your server, which may give insight into where the requests are coming from or what the user is trying to accomplish. And finally, we just have a few references that were used for this PowerPoint.